IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I am Amit Kumar, a research analyst with the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies. And I am joined by my colleague, Anushka Saxena, also a research analyst with the program. Happy to have you here, Anushka.
Thanks, Amit. Happy to be here.
So just a few days ago, we heard a lot of news surrounding cyber attacks, an alert wherein Apple sent to its mobile phone users, some of which were Indian political leaders and even personnel from media outlets like The Wire and Observer Research Foundation, a leading think tank in India. And the alert stated that, quote unquote, state-sponsored attackers might be trying to steal sensitive information from these mobile phones, right? So, but not a lot of complete or appropriate information has been received on the subject yet since these announcements. But it has speculations surrounding India's readiness to look at the threats in the cyberspace. And the Minister for Electronics and Information Technology stated that Apple's information was incomplete and its statements appear to be vague, right? However, just the fact that such an alert was issued warrants a discussion on where India stands vis-a-vis its cybersecurity preparedness at the moment. In today's episode, we'll be delving into some of the issues pertaining to India's cybersecurity policy, both on the domestic front and in terms of its multilateral engagement. So, Anushka, my first question to you is, what is the nature of the threat India is facing when it comes to the cyberspace? Would you please elaborate it in the interest of our listeners?
Right. Thanks, Amit. I think that's a very important question to address in the light of the alert that Apple obviously issued. No matter the completeness of the alert or evidence to kind of support it, the fact that there is suspected attack on Apple phones users and personal information thereof means that India is still not at a stage where it can counter any and all cybersecurity related issues. And of course, no country is perfect in this regard globally, and neither can it be since the cyberspace continues to evolve, and so do the threats in the cyberspace. But India might also want to consider a lot of things where it is still not at parity with other global powers. Of course, India is home to over 800 million internet users, 1.2 billion mobile users, many of which are smartphone users. And naturally, with such a large chunk of population that is engaged in activities in the cyber domain, cybersecurity remains a cause of concern, not just for citizens, but also for governments, which is union and states, and of course, businesses. And so, both domestically and at the international stage, India has tried to develop a governance structure to deal with this. But, like I said, in light of this news about Apple's alerts, as well as another recent piece of information that information of 815 million people might have been leaked from the Aadhaar database, just tells us, like I said, that India is facing a bigger threat, which is similar to what many of the other developing world economies are facing. So there's a very interesting risk survey report that is published by Pinkerton in collaboration with the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. And in the report that was last issued in 2022, information in cybersecurity ranked number 2 on the list of challenges that faced businesses and organizations. And I think IP theft, of which cyber enabled IP theft was number 1. So this just tells us that the numbers aren't going anywhere and are only expanding, which also has a lot to do with the sophistication of the nature of cyber attacks. And I think in 2022 itself, IANS also published numbers which said that cybersecurity incidents related to governmental agencies and institutions went from about 48,000 to about 192,000. That is a 4-time jump in numbers in just a year, right? And so it tells us that the governance infrastructure needs a lot more work. And I think in the context of the Indian IT infrastructure, data breaches constitute a major chunk of the challenge. Like I said, the Aadhaar incident just happened, at least it was reported to have happened. And such breaches also include illegal accessing of biometric information for over a billion Indian users that are registered with the Unique Identification Authority of India, of course, who have collated this data under the Aadhaar card regime. And there is reportage, and most of this reportage is from cybersecurity related firms like Cypherma, which say that such data has been sold for just 500 rupees on WhatsApp groups. It may have also been used for identity theft and potential surveillance. And so ultimately it impinges on the right to privacy and cybersecurity of the citizens. And both governmental and business actors have to respond and be held responsible for this. Because of the transnational nature of cyberspace, India is also at the risk of cyber attacks, not just internally, but also from foreign state and non-state actors, right? So one example of this is the Shadowpad malware attack that took place against power grid infrastructures in India in 2022, right? And the hackers responsible were believed to be Chinese state sponsored, and they were preying on Internet of Thing devices, and they were trying to navigate through compromised networks that were already compromised to ultimately engage in espionage activities. And this was in the Ladakh region, where just 2 years ago, before the attack reportedly happened, there was an eyeball to eyeball fight between Indian and Chinese troops. And this clearly tells us about the severity of the challenge, and it has multifaceted implications for a lot of things. Like I already said, right to privacy, but also data security, India's aim to develop Indian internet governance, go completely digital, and of course have a safe IT infrastructure in the country.
Right. And as far as I remember, lately in the last 1 year, there have been multiple cyber attacks that India has witnessed, the Indian population has witnessed. For instance, it began with first the electricity grid attack by the Chinese hackers that we talked about. Then came the attack on the personal health information that was taken from the records that the AIMS maintain, leading a medical institution in India. And now, lately, we have seen just a few days ago that Aadhaar details of India, about 800 million Indian people were stolen and were up for sale on internet, dark web, right? So these keeping all these in these incidents in context, on the background, what does India's current domestic apparatus looks like vis-a-vis the policy on cybersecurity? What are some of the key laws and governance strategies that India employs, and have there been any action on these fronts that on incidents that I just talked about?
Right. So I think obviously this backdrop warrants a discussion on India's policy architecture. And India does not necessarily have a uniform national policy on cybersecurity, but it has a host of cybersecurity related laws and regulations to determine liability in the case of breach of what we understand as responsible cyber behavior. Right. And of course, the most prominent of such legislations is the Information Technology Act of 2000, which was amended in 2008. and its purpose is to modernize some of the provisions of the civil and criminal liabilities, which were listed in the rather antiquated Indian Penal Code of 1860, right? Because the cyberspace is a post 1860 introduction, and so is the issue of cybersecurity. And so the IT Act takes from some of the provisions of the IPC and builds on them in a more context specific manner. And that's not all. The IT Act has other important aims as well, such as governance of cybercrime and institution of data protection regimes in India. Um, Articles like 43, 66, 67, they provide the basis for prosecution of crimes like identity theft, hacking, denial of services attacks, network tampering, and even cyber terrorism. And India lays down a lot of emphasis on the issue of cyber terrorism, akin to the cybersecurity policies of some more other developing countries, right? And in 2013, India experimented with a national cybersecurity policy, which was a very short 9-page document, but it listed out a 14-point strategy to build a secure and resilient cyberspace. But again, this policy does not have a binding effect, and most of its actionable items are too broad to encourage targeted policy action. Of course, there are also some actionable elements on which work has been done, like the operation of a 24/7 National Critical Information Infrastructure Protection Center. And what this does is it basically establishes a regulatory framework to govern critical information infrastructure. And CII and cybersecurity related incidents are all defined by the protection center. And now, because the NPIIPC has continued to define more and more government systems as protected under the CII category, any cyber attacks that are conducted against them, they are liable to be prosecuted as acts of cyber terrorism, which, if we go back, is punishable under Article 66F of the IT Act. And I think in June this year, the National Cybersecurity Council, the then National Cybersecurity Coordinator, Lieutenant General Rajesh Pant, announced that the Indian National Security Council was preparing to release a cybersecurity strategy, but the first public draft for this is yet to be revealed. And of course, one of the key domestic policy imperatives on cybersecurity is managing online hate speech and offensive messages, and some of this also constitutes the issue of cyber terrorism. And this has had implications for freedom of speech. Sometimes it has invited controversy surrounding regulatory interventionism. For example, when the IT Act was amended in 2008, the government introduced Article 66A, which laid out punishment for sending offensive messages through communication service. Now, due to its very, very broad ambit, and it said things like any in online information that has been circulated for the purpose of causing annoyance or inconvenience. And so these terminologies, which are so vague and can be interpreted in an n number of ways, invited a lot of controversy, and ultimately Article 66A was struck down in 2015 by the Supreme Court. But in subsequent years, the government has utilized powers under other articles of the IT Act, like 69A, 69B, and 79A, to block accounts and take down user content on social media. We heard a lot in the past few years about how Facebook and Twitter have been asked to deploy a grievance officer so that this nodal person can coordinate with government agencies in case there is content online that is unfriendly or harms the sovereignty and integrity of India. And again, this is a broad mandate that the government has been working on. So essentially, the idea that this gives me is that, yes, there is indeed a lot of action towards criminalizing and prosecuting things like hacking and IP theft and identity theft, data breaches, so on and so forth. But also there is a top-down approach towards addressing some of the more privacy-related issues.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Right. So, the sense that I get from your response is that it's mostly the government that is directly involved in mitigating these concerns or responding to such actions. But I think I have at least I have noticed a distinction or there's a dichotomy in how the government responds when the attack is on any of the public firms, the public sector unit, or the government bodies, vis-a-vis the attacks on the records of usual citizens. Right, the government usually springs into action quickly when it's when the attack is on the government bodies or the government related sectors that government controls. But when it comes to a usual citizen, an individual citizen, the government isn't that responsive in terms of following up to any such threat or attacks, right? So, given this, what kind of role do you sense, or do you see a role for the private sector in ensuring national cybersecurity?
Right. So I think definitely there is a sense that governments spring into action in a more active manner when it comes to attacks against governmental agencies, and there have been a lot of them on organizations like ISRO, DRDO, of course, the power grids, and even in the military sphere. And the reason, which is very obvious for that, is that government has a larger access to a larger amount of data and has a larger mandate to cover, and naturally the data that the government agencies would store would have much more severe implications for national security. That said, of course, a citizen's privacy and security is equally important, especially in a democratic context. And I would say the private sector has an important role to play in this, because to begin with, it is private sector firms and cybersecurity agencies like Recorded Future or Cypherma that recognize that an attack has taken place against civil society, political agencies, or legal units, and that it needs to be acted upon. And of course, Kaspersky Lab is another. And so the private sector clearly has an important role to play. And yes, India's engagement with the issue of cybersecurity is indeed very top down and institutionalized. I think one of the government documents that talked about how government officials should use mobile phones said that the purpose of this document is to quote unquote institutionalize social media. So definitely the government springs into action when it feels that this definitely comes under the government's ambit, and government has every right to take action on it. So some of the issues vis-a-vis civil society become very blurred on that end. But given the highly privatized nature of critical information infrastructure itself, and of course ICT, the government of India cannot act alone, and it has to build resilience in partnership with the private sector. And for this, there is a need for a multi-stakeholder mechanism to support India's priorities. To begin with, many cyber powers like Russia, China, the US, and even India, they have not signed on to the Paris call for trust and security in the cyberspace, which was instituted by the French government in 2018. And the primary purpose of the Paris call is to develop a multi-stakeholder mechanism that ropes in academia, think tanks, private sector, so on and so forth. But India has made some progress, which is through the institution of a consultative conference called the Internet Governance Forum. And at the IGF, a lot of private sector entities come together and interact to discuss policy towards cybersecurity. And I think some Indian officials from MEA, like Got Survey, have also indicated that there is a shift in India's stance significantly, because they have offered to break the deadlock between state actors on multi-stakeholder participation at the international stage. And I think Got Survey did this in his speech at the United Nations Security Council in 2021. And so this is a significant shift of stance, but it's a little ironic also, given that India is yet to institute a formal multi-stakeholder policy internally. But yes, as India builds resilience in cyberspace, engaging private sector firms and NGOs and even think tanks and civil society will become pertinent.
So what I gather from what you have said is on the front of I mean in terms of roping in the private players is something that Indian government has to work on. It's a work in progress in India. In India, the private sector hasn't been as much involved as the Indian state itself ensuring national cyber security, right? And this brings me to the question of India's participation in multilateral engagement. So, has India been part of a lot of multilateral engagement on cybersecurity and responsible state behavior?
Right. So, yes, India indeed has participated in a lot of multilateral frameworks on cybersecurity and responsible state behavior. And it has also implemented some of its domestic imperatives in its statements at the multilateral stage. So, for example, India is part of both of the major UN led mechanisms on cybersecurity, which is the open ended working group on security of and in use of ICTs, and the sixth UN group of governmental experts on advancing responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And at the OEWG is working up to 2025, and India is a constant partner in its consultative process. And India has also, of course, made use of diplomacy to advocate responsible state behavior, especially since it faces a direct challenge from its neighbors, China and Pakistan. And so it has tried to rally the troops in its favor in this context. And I think India's emphasis on cybersecurity at the global stage, like I said, reflects a lot of its domestic priorities, because India has time and time again requested for the inclusion of the term cyber terrorism in reports published by the OEWG and the UN group of governmental experts. And it in last year's episode, or last year's annual progress report of the OEWG, India supported the inclusion of a provision to strengthen law enforcement cooperation to prevent the use of cyberspace for terrorist purposes. India has also been a vocal advocate of establishing a global point of contact directory, and it has taken examples from the institution of such a POC directory from other UN confidence building measures, like in disarmament and nuclear issues. And it says that such a directory should be instituted with the purpose of determining a nodal point of contact between a host of states, who can be a technical or a diplomatic person, for the purpose of de-escalating if there is a cybersecurity related emergency. And India has also aimed to further capacity building in the multilateral sphere. And a lot of its emphasis on this capacity building is coming from its experiences with CERT-INS, which are the Indian Computer Emergency Response Teams, and the Telecom Cybersecurity Incident Response Team. And what these teams do is that they look at cybersecurity breaches and incidents in the country, may those be related to the private sector or governmental institutions, and then they respond to them and build capacity, right? And in India's submission to the draft annual report for July 2023, India proposed that the POC directory should take into account and complement the work of regional and sub-regional fora on incident response and security certs and CSIRT's networks, which obviously means that India lays a lot of emphasis on not only establishing a global POC, but also utilizing the knowledge and the expert base of countries and their response mechanism policy institutions like the CERTINs. And most recently, India has also submitted a working paper on developing a global cybersecurity cooperation portal, which is another portal, and one of its elements is again the POC directory. But the proposal of this portal, which is meant to be a largely member state led initiative, again lacks one major element, which is proactive participation from multiple stakeholders like NGOs in the private sector. So again, India would have to readjust its stance if the discussions on the development of this portal go ahead.
Yeah, so it looks like India has been quite active indeed in terms of engaging the global community on the issue of cybersecurity and threat, right? Uh, but the problem is that when it comes to its on domestic issues, wherein cyber threats have been a cause of concern, the Indian state has been found lacking in terms of responding to those challenges and at least even acknowledging the extent of threat that it poses to the Indian national security. With that, Anushka, this was a very fascinating conversation. Thank you for your time and all the knowledge that you brought in. And I'm sure that our listeners would have benefited from this discussion. Once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Amit, and thanks to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.